the clinking of silverware, the murmur of quiet conversation, and the soft hum of a classic jazz tune. Everything was as ordinary as it could be in a small, upscale restaurant tucked away in the heart of Manhattan. But in the midst of this usual, "Din, something extraordinary was about to happen. What do you do when someone you least expect is suddenly right in front of you?" The voice of the waitress, Anne, lingered in the air for a moment as if contemplating her own question. She had been working at the restaurant for years, serving high-profile celebrities, business tycoons, and politicians, but nothing in her. Extensive experience had prepared her for the evening that would unfold. It was an unassuming Tuesday, the type of night that wouldn't be remembered by anyone except those involved in the small, intimate setting of the restaurant. But fate had other plans. The door swung open, and in walked a woman who, despite her calm demeanor, carried a storm in her wake. A storm that would soon ripple through the entire restaurant. Melania Trump. Her entrance caused a subtle shift in the energy of the room. Conversations slowed, and a hush fell over the crowd, but the former First Lady appeared unfazed, her elegant poise undisturbed by the sudden attention. She was just another diner after all, until Anne, the waitress, found herself standing before her table, her eyes locking with Melania's. Anne had seen Melania on television, had read the headlines, and, like many people, had formed an opinion, one that was far from favorable. It wasn't just the political background or the public persona. There was something about her presence that irked Anne. Maybe it was the way the former First Lady seemed so removed from the world, as if untouchable, almost untarnishable by the everyday struggles of regular people. It was this animosity, subtle yet palpable, that Anne couldn't shake. And as fate would have it, she was now face to face with the woman who had unknowingly come to symbolize so much of what Anne resented about wealth and privilege. Anne took a deep breath, and for just a moment, wondered what would happen if she spoke her mind. It was a fleeting thought, a split-second decision that would change everything. What could one small remark do in the grand scheme of things? Little did Anne know her words would set off a chain of events that none of them, herself, Melania, or anyone in the restaurant, would ever forget. Anne's hands trembled slightly as she approached the table, a tray of water glasses balanced, in one hand, the other clutching a notepad. The restaurant's dim lighting cast a soft glow over the polished wooden surface of the table where Melania Trump sat, her eyes scanning the menu with an air of disinterest, as though she had been here 1,000 times before. Anne, however, had only been in this world for a few years, a world of well-to-do diners and polished smiles. She wasn't used to seeing the likes of Melania up close, but it wasn't just the fame that stirred something in Anne. It was the sense of cold detachment, the kind of aloofness that seemed to radiate from the former First Lady. She wasn't just a high-profile guest. She was a reminder of everything Anne resented, the inequality, the luxury, the entitlement. It was a clash of worlds, and Anne didn't have the tools to navigate it. With a practiced smile, Anne leaned in to offer the water. "Would you care for any appetizers, Mrs. Trump?" she asked, keeping her tone professional, but strained. Melania looked up, her gaze meeting Anne's for the first time, and in that moment, something shifted. Anne felt a pang of irritation surge in her chest. She had never been the type to tolerate arrogance, and though Melania's expression remained serene, there was a flicker of disdain in her eyes, a subtle, almost imperceptible reaction to Anne's presence. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Anne's grip tightened around the tray. The words slipped out before she could stop them. "Maybe you should try the lobster. You know, just like the rest of us. Or is that too common for you?" Her voice was low but sharp, laced with an unmistakable edge. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an outburst, but the words landed like a slap in the quiet restaurant, and in that instant, Anne knew she had crossed a line. Melania's eyes flickered with surprise, then narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, palpable. Anne felt a flush of heat creep up her neck, her face burning with the sudden realization of what she had just done. She could hear the quiet gasps from nearby tables, the quick shift in the atmosphere, as the other diners processed what had just occurred. Behind Anne, Jason, her manager, appeared at the kitchen doorway. His face dropped when he saw the scene unfolding. His relationship with Anne had always been one of understanding. He knew her quick temper, her sharp tongue, and the way she sometimes let her emotions get the best of her. But this was beyond the usual banter. Anne! Jason's voice was stern, his eyes flicking nervously between her and Melania. The air crackled with tension, and Anne's heart raced. There was no turning back now. Anne stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like an invisible hand. The words she'd spoken, so thoughtless, so reckless, hung in the air between her and Melania. She could feel the eyes of the other diners burning into her, the judgment almost tangible. She had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. Jason was quickly at her side, his face tight with concern. "Anne," he muttered under his breath, low enough so only she could hear. "What the hell did you just do?" Anne felt her throat tighten, her mind racing as the reality of her words hit her. She had crossed a line, but she couldn't figure out if she regretted it or not. Her heart pounded in her chest, her palms clammy against the tray she was still holding. For a moment, she considered apologizing, trying to diffuse the situation before it spiraled any further. But then, a deep, almost primal part of her resisted. Why should she apologize? Wasn't this woman, this symbol of privilege, everything? And despised. Hadn't she just spoken the truth, in a world that often felt like it didn't allow people like her to speak at all? Jason's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and urgent. "Anne, go to the back, now." Anne blinked, taken aback. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't about her pride. It was about saving the restaurant from the fallout of her impulsive outburst. I can't just leave," Anne said, her voice shaky. "What if she gets angry? What if she—" Jason cut her off with a hand on her shoulder. "I'll handle it. Go." Reluctantly, Anne stepped away from the table, the sound of her shoes tapping against the polished floor seeming louder with each step. As she passed the other diners, she could feel their gaze on her, some of it sympathetic, others laced with judgment. The whispers started almost immediately. She could hear snippets of hushed conversation, people trying to make sense of what had just happened. But even as she reached the back of the restaurant, Anne couldn't shake the feeling of dread gnawing at her. She pressed her palms to her face, leaning against the cold kitchen door, her stomach in knots. What had she done? The moment of self-doubt crept in, gnawing at her confidence. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe she had lost everything, her job, her dignity, her reputation. But then, a thought pierced through the panic. What if this wasn't about her at all? What if this was about standing up to the injustice she had lived with her whole life? Anne lifted her head, her jaw setting with renewed determination. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. As Anne stood in the back, trying to calm her breathing and steady her hands, the kitchen buzzed with activity. Her co-workers moved. Around her, some whispering, some pretending not to notice the storm brewing just a few feet away. But in Anne's mind, the world felt like it was spinning out of control. She hadn't expected to feel guilty, not about what she had said, at least. But now, in the silence of the back room, the weight of it began to press down on her chest. Why did it feel like she was the one who had done something wrong? She could feel the judgment, the shame. It was a sharp contrast to the anger she had felt when she first spoke to Melania. The thought gnawed at her. Just then, Jason burst through the door, his face pale. "Anne, we need to talk." Her heart skipped. She looked up at him, anxiety swirling in her stomach. "What happened?" she asked, her voice a mixture of dread and disbelief. Did she complain?" Jason shook his head, but his expression was grave. "No, but you're not going to believe this." Anne's pulse quickened. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Did Melania demand a refund? Did she call security? Was she going to be fired on the spot? Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice. "She asked to speak with you." Anne's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't decide if that was a relief or an even bigger nightmare. Was this her chance to apologize? To somehow make things right? "Why?" Anne asked, confused. "After what I said, why would she want to talk to me?" Jason shrugged, his face a mix of disbelief and something else. Curiosity, maybe. "I don't know, but she insisted. She wants to meet you in the private dining room." Anne's thoughts were a blur. Was Melania angry? Was she about to tear into her, make her regret every word? Or had she, shockingly, taken Anne's comment in stride? Either way, Anne's heart raced. But beneath the fear was something else, a spark of intrigue. What did Melania Trump want with her? Jason lingered by the door. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but you've got to face this. Whatever happens, you've got to hold it together." Anne nodded, swallowing hard. For the first time that evening, she felt her fear give way to a strange, unfamiliar calm. This wasn't about defending herself anymore. It was about finding out why Melania had asked for her, and what that might mean for both of them. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was to come. This moment would shape everything. The private dining room was dimly lit, the air thick with the kind of tension Anne had never known in her years of waiting tables. As she stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind her, the quiet hush of the restaurant suddenly muffling into an eerie silence. There, sitting at the far end of the room, was Melania Trump. She was serene, her posture flawless, her face an enigmatic mask. She looked like she was in complete control, yet there was something in the air, an unspoken challenge that made Anne's heart race. Anne hesitated, standing just inside the doorway, unsure of what to do or say. Should she apologize? Should she make small talk, pretend everything was fine? The words she had spoken earlier, sharp, cutting, still echoed in her mind, and the guilt crept up again. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Melania finally looked up, her gaze steady, almost piercing, yet calm. "Sit down, Anne." The command was gentle, but there was no mistaking its authority. Anne took a deep breath and moved to the chair across from her, the tension between them thickening with every second. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Anne could feel her palms sweating, her nerves flaring as she waited for the storm she was sure was coming. But instead, Melania remained silent, her expression unreadable. "I know what you're thinking," Melania finally said, her voice soft but edged with an underlying strength. "That I'm just another rich, privileged person who doesn't understand anything about real life." Anne's heart skipped a beat. Had Melania read her mind? Or had she simply been so accustomed to being misjudged that she knew exactly what Anne was thinking? "I've heard it before," Melania continued, her eyes steady on Anne. "I know how people see me. But you have no idea who I really am, or what I've had to fight for to get here." Anne was stunned. She had expected an angry tirade, a confrontation over the words she had spoken, but instead there was something else in Melania's voice: vulnerability. The sharp edges that Anne had assumed were the result of arrogance seemed now to be a protective shield. Melania leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. I may not have the life you want, Anne, but we are not so different, you and I. You fight for your survival every day in this world. I fought too. Anne stared at her, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. Was this a game? A manipulation? Or was there some truth in what Melania was saying? She felt herself softening, her defensiveness cracking open like an egg, revealing a sliver of understanding. I don't expect you to like me, Melania added, her voice lowering. But I think you need to understand something about power, about what it takes to hold on to it, and about what people like us give up to keep it. I wasn't born into this world. It was built, piece by piece, and it wasn't easy. The weight of Melania's words settled on Anne like a blanket, heavy and suffocating, but strangely warm. In that moment, Anne understood that the woman across from her wasn't just a symbol of everything she resented. She was a person, too. A person who had fought tooth and nail for her place in a world that would chew you up and spit you out if you weren't strong enough. Why me? Anne finally whispered. The question that had been gnawing at her since the moment Jason told her Melania had asked to speak with her. Melania met her eyes directly, and for the first time, Anne saw something raw beneath the calm exterior. A flicker of humanity. Because I see something in you. You're not like the others. You speak your truth. You're unafraid of what anyone thinks. The words hung in the air, and Anne felt a strange, exhilarating rush. She saw something in me. The world seemed to shift as Anne sat in that moment of revelation. What she had thought was a confrontation, a battle for dominance, was actually an opening, a bridge between two people from vastly different worlds. Melania, the woman Anne had so quickly judged, was offering something far more valuable than an apology: understanding. Anne took a deep breath, letting the weight of it all sink in. The hostility that had fueled her words melted away, replaced by something else. A connection. In that instant, Anne realized that what she had said, what she had feared, wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far more profound than she could have ever imagined. The silence in the private room seemed to stretch, but this time it wasn't the awkward kind. It was filled with something deeper, a moment of mutual understanding that neither woman had expected, yet both seemed to recognize. Anne, her thoughts whirling, sat across from Melania, not knowing exactly what to say, but feeling the enormity of what had just transpired. Melania's words had struck Anne harder than any of her insults or judgments had. You're unafraid of what anyone thinks. Those words echoed through her mind, and for the first time in a long while, Anne wasn't sure whether to be angry or humbled. She had always prided herself on her blunt honesty, on her refusal to bend to the expectations of others. But now, facing Melania, she wondered if it had always been about defiance, or about fear. Fear of being overlooked, judged, ignored by those who seemed to hold all the power. Fear of being nothing more than a voice in a crowded room of silence. Melania broke the stillness with a soft exhale, almost as though she had been waiting for Anne to process the gravity of their exchange. You're a lot like me in some ways, Anne. I'm sure you've been told your whole life that you don't belong, that you don't have the right to stand up, to speak your mind, to demand the respect you deserve. I've spent most of my life fighting against that. You don't see it, but every move I make is scrutinized, every word twisted. It's exhausting, but I do it anyway, because that's what it takes to survive. Anne nodded slowly, her mind reeling from the rawness in Melania's voice. It was a side of the former First Lady she had never seen before, and it gave her pause. She had spent so much of her life looking at people like Melania with disdain, assuming their wealth and privilege insulated them from the struggles that Anne had known. But now, in this room, they were two women, both fighting, in different ways, for their voices to be heard. For a moment, Neither of them spoke, simply allowing the weight of their words to settle between them. Anne's thoughts began to clear, and in that clarity, something shifted. She realized that her encounter with Melania wasn't just about a single offhand comment. It was a reflection of something deeper, of the divisions between people, the way they were quick to judge, to assume, without ever taking a moment to understand what was really happening beneath the surface. "You're right," Anne said, her voice quiet but steady. "I've spent so much time assuming who you were. I didn't even think about why you might be the way you are, what you've had to go through." Melania gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's easy to assume, isn't it? Easier than trying to see things from another person's perspective." Anne's breath caught in her chest, and she felt the truth of that deep in her bones. She had been so certain, so sure of her own convictions, that she had never considered the possibility that someone else, even Melania Trump, might have faced battles of their own. That understanding, in its simplicity, felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. It wasn't that Anne needed to like Melania or agree with her views, but she now understood that every person, no matter their status, no matter their wealth, faced challenges that were just as real as her own. As Anne stood to leave, the weight of the conversation lingered like a soft hum in the back of her mind. Jason was waiting by the door when she emerged from the private room, his face still marked with concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice tentative. Anne nodded, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't expected. "Yeah, it's fine. I think I just learned something." Jason's brow furrowed. "About Melania?" She shook her head, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "No, about myself." She walked away from the room, her pace steady, her heart lighter than it had been in hours. As she moved through the restaurant, the chatter of the other diners returned to her ears, but she was no longer part of the noise. She had crossed a threshold, one that had forced her to look deeper, not only into the lives of others, but into her own. What she had assumed to be a simple, one-sided confrontation had opened the door to something entirely different. Understanding. Not just of Melania, but of herself. As she reached the kitchen, Anne turned to Jason, a quiet determination in her voice. "I think I'm ready to change the way I see things. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'll figure it out." Jason gave her a nod, his smile more relieved than anything. "I'm glad to hear that." And with that, Anne took a deep breath and stepped back into the rhythm of the night, her heart a little fuller, her world a little bigger. Sometimes, the people you least expect can show you more about yourself than you ever imagined. And sometimes, it only takes one conversation to shift everything. It wasn't the end, Anne thought as she moved toward the tables. It was the beginning of understanding.